Hello, this is Michael, and welcome to the Mind of Christ, Christianity for a Modern Age. Here on this channel, we explore what I call inner Christianity, biblical interpretation, spiritual experiences, and practical living, all through the lens of the ancient Christian wisdom tradition. I'm really glad you're here checking us out. So it's time to take a break from prepping for your church's trunk or treat event for today's special spooky season edition of the Mind of Christ. Today's teaching is Ghosts, a Haunting. So unlike your church pastor, the Mind of Christ, we don't shy away from exploring some of the more unusual phenomena in the realm of spirituality. Again, all in the context of the Christian wisdom tradition. But we talk about spiritual gifts, we talk about spiritual phenomena, spiritual warfare, angels and demons. And this teaching today is specifically on what folklore might call a ghost. And you might not even believe in ghosts as they're kind of traditionally understood or popularly understood. And it's funny because in any matters of spirituality, there's this saying, and the saying is, well, there's no scientific proof, but there are witnesses. So maybe you're someone who's had like a ghostly experience, or you know someone. I mean, this stuff is all over our culture too. It's in our TV shows, it's in our stories. And in all of that stuff, I think there's a deeper kernel of the truth that we can kind of explore and learn about together. So this teaching isn't so much about ghost hunting or trying to convince anyone of the reality of ghosts. It's more of a teaching on my theory and my experiences with this type of presence. And without relying on pop culture tropes, I'm going to share my definition of a ghost, and I'm going to share one seemingly profound story with you. And I'll also give some general suggestions about these kind of experiences at the end of the video. But if you're new here, I want to encourage you to subscribe to our channel. Comment below. I would love to hear about your experiences or your questions or your own insights. And of course, check out all of our resources. We have over 100 teachings on biblical interpretation, practical living, spiritual gifts, spiritual warfare on our Mind of Christ website. The links for that are in the description. And of course, share this video, like this video. And again, I would encourage you just to leave your comments. So let's jump in. So the idea of a ghost, well, this is something that has existed since the beginning of time, basically. And I went on Wikipedia and I wanted to see what kind of the definition of a ghost is. And Wikipedia said that a ghost is the soul or spirit of a dead person that is believed by some people to appear to the living. So that's simple enough. And I think that this is the definition that we are most familiar with given our pop culture. But I'm not sure that this really is the best definition in terms of a Christian worldview or a spiritual Christian worldview. And if you're here, you don't necessarily need to identify as a Christian to kind of hold the belief that the soul or spirit lives on after life in the body. Okay, this is kind of spirituality and religion 101. So after death, our soul kind of shifts states and we prepare for life in the spiritual realm. Paul tells us in Philippians, our citizenship is in heaven. So simply put, we know that our spirit moves on. So although our popular culture will have us kind of believe that ghosts are those spirits, the spirits of dead people who have moved on, who are in the next realm, I'm going to contend that that's not actually the case. And we also have a very strong idea that a ghost or a ghostly entity is a spirit of this person who just can't quite make it to the next realm, right? They're stuck for one reason or another. They need to be released somehow. We need to help them get to the next realm. And I think this idea kind of sticks closer to what a ghost actually is. But remember, like, our spirit is destined for life in the beyond. Our spirit is destined for what happens next. Our destiny is not to remain kind of stuck on this plane of existence. It's to move into the next realm. And this is where I'm going to offer my definition of a ghost. It's not literally a soul or a spirit that gets stuck. It's actually an energetic duplicate. It's a copy of a soul that has moved on. And this duplicate, it's not an exact copy of the soul that has moved on. It's a fragment. And this fragment, or this energy, it can take on certain characteristics of the deceased individual. We watch things in our entertainment, or we read books, or we hear stories. More rarely, we hear these stories of people who are being haunted, perhaps. You know, they're feeling things touch them. They're having cabinets open. They're feeling things at night. So I want to explain this a little bit more because I think it's going to make a lot of sense. If you can imagine a ghost, let's go back to this idea of a ghost as an energetic duplicate. Well, this energy gets created by what I kind of call spiritual friction. And a ghost is an energy that is created through spiritual friction. So if you just go ahead and you rub your hands together vigorously, you'll notice that you're going to generate some heat. There's some sort of energy transfer that's happening as you do that. That's friction. And spiritual friction is actually something we all can feel as we live out of alignment with God's alignment, as we live out of that design for our lives. We'll feel like we're not quite living in alignment with that peace and joy. There's even a little bit of friction there. But what happens is there can be singular events that generate an incredible amount of spiritual friction, or chronically persistent events that are generating a lot of spiritual friction. And these events, and they can be trauma related, these events then kind of create this duplicate based on their point of origin. So whether this was a person involved in a traumatic event or whatever it was, there's this intense energy that's created in the moment, and this energy can adopt the characteristics of the individual that was involved. And these energies then become tethered or tied to people that are their point of origin. And this is why we see this a lot in pop culture. There's a ghost that's produced from some sort of traumatic event or death or car accident or whatever it might be. And again, these events can be very brief, like a sudden traumatic death, or they can be chronic, prevailing, something like torture or chronic mental abuse, chronic physical abuse. And because it sounds crazy, I actually want to share a story from my own personal experience to kind of illustrate my definition here, illustrate my point. So the first thing I want to point out by this story is before this happened, I was completely skeptical, okay? Even though I grew up Christian, I didn't believe in any of the spiritual stuff, any of the spiritual phenomena, even gifts of the Spirit. I thought that stuff was crazy. I didn't think it was real. I didn't think it existed. So years ago, this is about a decade now, I lived on a lake, and I had a neighbor. We're going to call her Rose. And Rose was a seemingly very nice old lady. She was a widow, but she would always have these kind of crazy stories about her house. And I initially thought that she was just making up these stories for my attention, to be honest. So one day, Rose went out of her way to share a little bit of the history of this lake we lived on. And originally, if you're familiar, it had been a Shaker settlement. And on this Shaker settlement, hundreds of years ago, there's this story that these young girls fell through the ice on the lake and they died. So Rose was kind of connecting very strange phenomena that was happening in her house with this event. So for instance, she would hear children giggling at night. She would hear balls rolling down her hallway. She would have her doorknob rattle, stuff like that. Now, of course, I didn't verify any of this at the time. I just listened. And again, I thought she was making this up. I thought she was just someone who liked the drama of it. But then things started to get interesting because I would come home from work and Rose would come running out to tell me things. So one day I came home and she came out and she said, Michael. And I went in her house and all these cans were spilled out of her one of her cabinets. And she would say it was the ghosts. And I, of course, am still thinking that she's making this up. So I continued to kind of remain skeptical until a couple of things really grabbed my attention from her. So this was something that I could verify and see. So I came home one day and the entire back room in Rose's house, the ceiling had just randomly collapsed. And she had no idea why. It was her antique room. And I remember talking to her and she was like, oh, I think it's connected to these old antiques. Should I burn this? Should I burn that? And I was in over my head. I had no idea. I just thought the roof collapsed. But then the insurance adjuster had told her that he was surprised because there was a lot of integrity in that part of the home. So, okay, I'm starting to kind of pay a little bit more attention here to this issue that's going on. Her roof collapsed randomly. She has all these strange phenomena in her house. One day she had all these bats randomly show up in her house. Very bizarre. So a little bit of time passed and it's one night and I'm sitting in my room and I get a text from Rose. And Rose is like, hey, can you come over? And I'm like, oh God, here we go again. So I show up at Rose's door and she's anxious, she's scared. And she says, look at this. And she pulled down her shirt and down her back was this claw. Frankie, it looked like a claw mark. So it was 3 red scratches right from her neck to her back. And she said, I was sitting here watching TV and all of a sudden I had this little porcelain animal. It picked up off the mantle and flew across the room. And when I went up to get it, I felt this thing push me and now I have this on my back. Okay, at this point, I'm like a little scared. I don't know what I was. I'm a little bit like, okay, what is really going on here? Is she making this up? But just the angle, the way the scratch was, and a little bit of my understanding kind of about demons or whatever, I was like, okay, maybe this is, some sort of like demonic presence or ghost. So I think that at this point, like the skeptic of me in me is kind of melting away a little bit. And I said, hey, look, let's just pray. So we just prayed for peace in the house, prayed for Jesus to be present, whatever it was. So the next day, or a couple of days later, I check in with her and I'm like, I really hope this is over. I'm crossing my fingers. And I check in with her and I said, hey, are you still having issues? And she said, yeah, it's gotten a lot worse since we prayed together. And I thought, oh, great. She said, it's been getting worse. It's been intensifying. I was laying in bed and something grabbed my legs and tried to pull me out of bed, which, by the way, is a common kind of night terror manifestation that if you know someone, they maybe have experienced this. So at this point, I'm like, okay, is this a ghost? Is this a demon? All I know for sure is that this is some sort of presence. And this presence is acting malevolently and targeting this specific woman. So I want to help this older woman. I don't know what's going on. I don't know if I'm just naive and gullible and she wants to just hang out with me. I don't know. But I decide that I'm just going to spend the night at this woman's house. So I go back to my house. I gather up some things, and then I just felt like, oh, that's not actually a good idea. And so I just started praying about it. And as I was praying, I just felt God say to me, like, hey, this is unforgiveness. And that's kind of really all I got. So I was like, okay, I feel like I know this woman well enough where I'm going to go and share this with her. So I go back over to her house and I just said, hey, Rose, I'm not going to stay at your house. But I want to know, like, is there someone in your life who you have a strong connection to where maybe you're unable to forgive them? And I said, from my limited knowledge, unforgiveness can kind of cause this kind of spiritual activity. So Rose got really quiet for a moment and then said to me, yes, I haven't been able to forgive my late husband. And she went on to tell me that the last several years of his life were really abusive. She used to get locked in her room. He used to swear at her, used to physically, mentally, emotionally abuse her. And I said, you haven't been able to forgive him for any of this? And she said, no. And then surprisingly, this came out of her mouth. She said, I lay there at night and into the darkness. I hate his name. I curse his name. I swear at him. And here I am thinking, oh, okay, now we're getting somewhere with understanding why this might be happening. So I said to her, I think the spiritual activity will stop if you can forgive him. And she just said, I can't. And I said, look, if you're able to just give 1%, like a tiny part of forgiveness, I guarantee you God's going to do the rest. So we just sat down and we prayed again, and we just prayed a prayer of forgiveness. We prayed for peace in the house. We just prayed for Rose to kind of release this burden or release this connection, whatever it might be. And it was that. It was very simple. Not much was said. I left. Fast forward, it's the next day. I get home from work. I go to check on her. She's a mess. She looks like she's been crying all day. She looked awful, frankly. And I just said, hey, are you okay? And she just said, I don't know what you did. I don't know what you did to me. I've been crying all night. I feel awful, but I feel like something's been released. And she just looked like, she had been crying all day. And I was able to kind of intuitively recognize, although this was one of my first experiences with this kind of phenomenon, I was able to recognize that she was getting a spiritual and emotional release. So all that pent up energy that was in her was being released. And here's what's interesting about this. Rose never had a problem in her house again. There was no manifestation. There was no things tugging on her at night. There were no sounds in the hallway. There was no issue structurally with the house. She didn't have car alarms going off randomly in the middle of the night. All this stuff ended with that. So what can we take away from this story? Well, I'm going to go back to my definition that a ghost is a duplicate energy of someone who is deceased, and it can mimic certain qualities. And this prolonged friction, this prolonged emotional tension, spiritual tension between Rose and her husband who had been alive at the time, this generated a lot of that spiritual friction, which over time has the capacity, depending on its intensity, it can create a ghost-like entity. And this presence acted in malice toward Rose, kind of continuing the pattern that had been going on before the husband had died. I believe that directed intention, belief towards something, nourishes spiritual energies. So this energy was kind of being kept vitalized and alive by Rose kind of constantly acknowledging it and swearing at it and all these certain things. That was kind of keeping this connection alive. And this connection was so strong that it was creating these manifestations in our realm of experience. And I also believe that this was made even stronger by the fact that Rose believed that there was a ghost. So you have the kind of hatred and unforgiveness, and then you also have the belief that there's an entity or a ghost here, and it's kind of just creating a lot of support for this presence to exist. And some people listening are like, wow, that sounds a lot like a demon. And it's like, yeah, but also I think, and as we talk about on this channel, there's different elements of demonic oppression. certainly I would call this a ghost, frankly. And certain elements of this ghost, certainly it's taking on some of these demonic characteristics. But in my experience, in terms of demonic warfare, demonic oppression, a lot of it's more mental. And in this case, we had a lot of very physical manifestations over time that is kind of mimicking or imitating what we would know in popular culture as ghost-like activity. And now since then, what I've noticed over the years is, from what I hear from people who might reach out or whatever it is, ghosts are like fragrances. So if we're not nourishing them, if we're not resupplying them over time, they eventually just kind of dissipate and disappear. And remember, it's not the individual, it's a copy of the individual, an energetic copy that's assuming certain characteristics. So once we stop kind of stoking that energy, their constitution just kind of dissolves and they're done and they're gone. So we have these kind of malevolent entities, and I know from people's experiences that we also get non-malevolent. So maybe you live in an old house and, you hear people say, we got a ghost here and it doesn't really bother us. Well, that ghost is still there from, if it's a very old home, just the constant lived-in condition of the people who live there, or just the constant friction of their lives, the constant spiritual friction. And it's those fragments that gets left behind. It's not the literal people that live there. And ghosts can tie themselves to people, locations, like I just said, or specific objects. So I just have a couple of suggestions for you if you know someone, or maybe you've been through this already, you kind of know. And again, this is not me so much relying on tropes as it is really understanding the spiritual phenomena and dealing with it. And the first thing I want to say is we're not spiritual ghost hunters. So I know there's people who are very interested in this phenomena and they'll go to haunted locations hoping to see something or experience something. And I would actually advise against that. I would not seek out some sort of spiritual experience just to have that experience. And the reason for that is we can sometimes find ourselves in spiritual situations where we don't really have the keys and we don't understand. And that can make things a lot worse. And I know people who have been in this position where they get themselves into some sort of spiritual predicament. They're having a lot of different phenomena or issues in their life and they don't know how to stop it. And that's because they kind of got themselves into it purposefully. And then they have a problem because they don't know how to get out of it. That being said, I definitely think that there's times when we're called to aid in spiritual problems, but I think God kind of pulls us into this naturally. I didn't go seeking that experience with my neighbor. It just kind of happened. And I learned a lot through it, but I didn't go seeking it out. Another key is not to be afraid, because we have God's help. And in that help, and in the name of Jesus, we really have everything we need. Any issue I've ever had with any sort of presence or people who I know who I've helped or whatever it might be, you use that name Jesus, you set that intention, that really helps you create that peace, helps an energy dissipate, helps your problem go away. That being said, resolution can't happen without God's help. So if you're having an issue or you know someone who's having an issue, the best thing you can do is pray with serious intention for God's help. And I know the way kind of gets made clear for that. So whatever it might be, if it's you feel like it's something tied to you, or you feel like it's something tied to a place or an object, a well-intentioned prayer that uses the name of Jesus for release, for forgiveness, whatever it might be, that's often enough for things to resolve and dissipate on their own. However, in more advanced cases, you can sometimes, help for the aid of an intuitively gifted person who can help you, someone who has experience with this. And they're oftentimes able to kind of recognize a presence, speak to it, acknowledge it, and just firmly tell it to leave. And what's rather interesting, and maybe you've had this experience of some sort, is after all these things resolve, people often report a dream. And in the dream, that presence will actually appear to them and thank them for helping them, which is really interesting. So this is kind of wrapping this up. Again, this is not some sort of exhaustive guide on the phenomena of ghosts, but it's just some theory, it's some practical experience that I've had with them. And again, there's these certain topics, especially if you're church, there's these certain topics that people are very taboo about, but there's also the reality that some people need help. And if we have a little bit more understanding about certain things, it can bring a lot of freedom, it can bring a lot of healing. So if you've benefited from this message, again, I would encourage you to like this video, share this video with someone who needs to see it. Leave your comment below. I would love to hear more about your own particular experiences with this. If you have something productive to add, please do so. Don't forget to check out our books and other resources. Those links are in the description. This is Michael from the Mind of Christ. Thanks for joining me for this holiday special. I'll see you soon.